Okay, so we're going to get to Plastic Ocean in just a few minutes. So let those images and that story stick with you. As I said, actually Wendy said, I'm Michael Kaplan, and this is Adam, Leipzig. And I thought that we would have a little bit of context setting before diving into the documentary and the most current documentary. Welcome.
Hi.
To Chicago.
It's good to be here.
An amazingly cold day.
Yes, I went from 100-degree Los Angeles to 40-degree Chicago, but I'd like to thank you for making sure it didn't snow.
We did set that up especially for you. So I thought we would set the context a little bit. You and I were just talking before we came in on how nobody we know who's under 30 started off saying, I want to be a documentary filmmaker while they were in college. It's something that they kind of evolved into. That happened to you, it happened to me, it happened to pretty much everyone we know. So can you talk a little bit about what you did want to do? And something we'll always come back to is storytelling. And so how did storytelling initiate your work, your first move into the work world?
You mean when I was larval?
Yes, well, yeah.
When I was just this big?
When you were just, as you were entering the world, what did you think? Well, let's skip that. Let's take to the, as you were just about the time you got your first job that you thought was a serious job.
Well, I am so fortunate because from the earliest memory, I wanted to work in theater. Because when I was a kid, I went to theater. It moved me, and it made me want to make those things happen for other people. And so truly my first serious job was in theater. I was the dramaturg and ultimately became one of the producers at the Los Angeles Actors Theater, which then became the Los Angeles Theater Center. The dramaturg, if you're not familiar with that term, is the person in a theater who helps to select the plays, figure out what plays will be programmed, works with the playwrights to develop them. If the plays need translation, supervise the translation, or in some cases I would do the translation, and then works to stand up on behalf of the narrative of the play and the playwright in the relationship of creating the piece that goes on and creating the production. And I think in a lot of ways I'm still a dramaturg. It's really what I do even as I make movies.
So you were drawn to work in the theater in kind of both a creative and a producerial kind of capacity. Certainly something that would prepare you to do documentaries, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure how.
Well, I think we know what did lead you there, but so what would then take you from working in LA, one of the major cities, major cultural cities in the country, into the film world, especially the more studio oriented?
Yeah, well, there was a point after I'd been at our theater for 7 years, I wanted to make work for a bigger audience. If we were really successful, 2,000 people would see a show, and then the show would close, and it just didn't feel large enough to affect the number of people I wanted to affect. So I decided I wanted to make movies. Yeah. And then I just went around town and found a way in, and I actually, it was a fortuitous time because there was new management at Walt Disney Studios, which had just come in. It's hard to remember back those times, but it was before Walt Disney Studios had ever had a movie that grossed more than $100 million. And there was a tiny new management team. Right. And I was part of that new management team that came in on the creative side and helped to reinvent that studio.
Right. So this would be ancient history for most of this audience, but this was a time before really The Lion King being the first major kind of breakout in that new mode. Is that correct?
There was Little Mermaid and Lion King, and I was there during that era. And also in that era, two of my first movies were Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and Dead Poets Society. Right. So it was that era. Two movies that you could not get made today.
Right,
sadly.
Not in a studio.
You could not get made today.
And not for that budget, correct. Yeah. So Making that transition from theater to the studio system must have been pretty mind-blowing.
It was very corporate
Yeah.
in a different way.
Yeah.
But there is this thing, it's really interesting because theater is the most nonprofit of all nonprofit things, and movie studios are about the most for-profit of all for-profit things. There's something that is clean and rational about the for-profit universe. As much as we may hate it and not like the fact that everything is about money, at least there's a metric. At least we know that the film's going to be made for this much money, and if it does that much money, it's made a profit, and it was okay,
Right.
and you get to make another one. In the nonprofit world, in theater, those metrics are not so clear.
Right.
And there was something that I appreciated about the clarity of those metrics. And in my career, I've really spent half of my time in the for-profit world, half my time in the nonprofit world, because after Disney, I ran National Geographic Films,
Right.
and National Geographic is a giant nonprofit. So I work back and forth between the for-profit and nonprofit sectors. And today, as I'm making documentaries, most of my documentaries are financed by nonprofits and international NGOs.
Right.
So it all kind of goes together for me.
It's a strange mix, but there is something, and I want to come back to that, about finding and reaching an audience, engaging an audience, which is something you and I have talked about that we
Yeah.
want to get to. So you spent about 10 years in the Disney world.
My life goes in 7-year increments.
Okay.
7 years at Disney, 7 years at Nat Geo.
Okay. So during those 7 years, what changed in terms of your view of what you want to be in? When you tell stories, when you're involved in telling stories, you got to tell some really great stories, which were both quality and found an audience, which is amazing and fantastic. So what changed for you? What did you learn during that time?
I learned that character is destiny. Character is narrative. And what I always go back to in all my movies is character, character, character.
Yeah. Okay. The corporate culture, more difficult to navigate, though.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about that and things that were not necessarily a story, though stories are great, but just an example of where a passion project got somehow it wasn't able to be made, or that there was just the corporate culture could not bear with that type of storytelling. Was there something?
You see, this was a somewhat different time in the movie business, and I was kind of lucky because I got my passion projects made.
Yeah.
And the economics of the business worked so you actually could get your passion projects made. And if there were times that you couldn't get something made, there were economic reasons why it just didn't foot. Now, at the same time, most projects I worked on I did not get made. I've made 34 movies now. It's because I tried to make 340 movies, and I failed more than 300 times.
Yeah.
So it's like that's the batting average. But the
1 out of 10.
Yeah, you just have to keep getting up and going at it again. But there's this thing about large organizations which are difficult to navigate. A lot of people have their fingers in the broth. Everybody's salting the soup. Many different layers have to make decisions. But it takes a large organization to do this thing, to open a movie, which is different from making a movie. Right? Like, anybody can make a movie. We can all pull out our mobile phones and make a movie, edit it, upload it to YouTube. We made a movie, done.
Right.
But to open a movie, by which I mean it's in 2,500 theaters, and you make $50 million opening weekend, which is opening a movie, it takes an organization of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people and a lot of money to do that.
Right.
That's something that can only be done inside a large corporation.
Absolutely. And that's, again, engaging an audience, finding a way to reach an audience. And in their case, they had a large structure and financing to be able to do
exactly.
it. So did something happen that precipitated, maybe not, that motivated your change to move on to
Yeah.
be running National Geographic Films?
Yeah, well, there was this transition period after I left Disney. I became an independent producer, and that led me to be at National Geographic Films. Yeah, the thing that precipitated it was that when I started at Disney, there were 8 people in the creative group, and there were 2 legendary executives who were running Disney who had just come over and hired me, Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, who were part of movie-making lore. 7 years later, those 8 people had become 130 people. We'd split into 3 different divisions. I'd been promoted up and up and up the ranks. I was now not making movies. I was supervising people who supervised people who supervised people who made movies. If I would go onto the set, you would hear in the in the corridors of the soundstage, "Suit on the set," which made me feel super uncomfortable because I don't really want to be a suit. And I didn't want to be an executive anymore. I wanted to produce. So that was the moment to say, I've had this experience. It's spectacular. It was my graduate education in filmmaking, and now it was time to move on.
Fantastic, fantastic. So, what was the goal of National Geographic at that point for their film division, and how did they see you fitting into that?
Yeah, well, the goal was, and the question was, could National Geographic make an imprint in the feature film business? They asked me to develop a strategy for that, which I did, and that was over about a 6-month period, and then they asked me to run the company after I developed that strategy.
Right, right. So they wanted to get films out to the film market, or they wanted to be a regular producer of films that they were going to be showing in other venues?
It was entirely for theatrical release.
Okay.
Yeah.
So their goal was to get how many films out per year? They didn't know at that point.
At that point, it was 1 or 2.
Right. Right.
If we were lucky.
Right. And as we know, and this has been fairly consistent throughout our lifetime, is that documentaries, there are little blips of moments when films get out to the theaters in a substantial way, but most of the time it's 1 or 2 that really kind of break through per year. But their goal was to kind of play in those waters.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and you were leading that charge. So it was not too long though after you were in there that this interesting Frenchman contacted you about this project he was working on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. In fact, it turned out to be our second film, which is crazy to have success like that on the second film.
Right.
When you're running National Geographic Films, you hear about crazy wildlife photographers out in the world. So you just hear about 3 crazy Frenchmen who had been wintering over in Antarctica for 13 months with 60mm cameras shooting footage of penguins. And you just sort of decide, well, you got to be there.
Right.
So I sent an editor to the lab in Paris to look at the footage. They were shooting on real film, not on digital, because film is actually a really stable medium in sub-freezing conditions, where digital cameras are funky and those chips don't always work. He went to Technicolor. He looked at about 40 hours of footage, called me and said, "It's in focus, that's about all I can tell you." And at that point, I decided, well, we should go take a flyer, because that was half the footage. If there's 80 hours of footage of penguins, somehow you've got to be able to cut a movie out of that, right?
Yeah.
So I called the agent who was representing the French production company, and I called a day too late. They had gotten into Sundance that morning. She refused to sell it to me over the phone. She said, "You're going to have to go to Sundance and compete with everybody else to buy the movie."
Right.
And 3 months later, we went to Sundance, competed with everybody else to buy the movie. I had made relationships with other distribution companies, because at that point, Nat Geo didn't have a significant enough distribution company to really push this movie out to theaters, to be able to open it in the way I just described opening a film. And we paid $1 million for the movie. And everybody in the entertainment industry laughed at me and derided me for about 3 months because I paid $1 million for a penguin movie.
Okay, so let's establish a couple things, because
it
is pretty hilarious. Even today it would be hilarious, right? So maybe even more so.
Yes.
So it had a certain form at that point. It had been edited. Was it rough cut, fine cut at that point?
Oh, it was edited as a finished movie.
Okay.
With a Euro EDM clubby kind of music score.
Okay.
And penguins that actually spoke in French.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think very few people know that. So these were basically kind of cartoony. Hey, get out of my way. Hey, you know.
Yeah, there's an egg that hatches in the middle of the movie, and a little penguin comes up and says, "Bonjour, mama. Bonjour, papa." It was, yeah. It was not a choice I would have made.
Well, yeah, and you're seeing this, and you didn't, in fact.
Yeah.
So how did that work? You said, not only this is worthwhile, let's pay the money, but it's going to have to change. You thought all those things at the same time? Pretty much?
I think it's really important, even when you're presented with a movie that appears to be finished, unless it's really in a theater and you've bought your ticket, the movie's never finished. You can still change everything. And this is an interesting film lesson in changing what you hear. So we changed everything you hear. We hired a great composer to compose an orchestral score, a poetic writer to write poetic words, hired Morgan Freeman to speak the words. And over the course of 90 days, we completely remade the movie that an audience receives.
Right.
If you ever want to compare them, if you buy it from Amazon Canada, they will sell you a double disc set with the French version over here and the English version over here, and you'll see the difference. Kind of interesting to compare.
Yeah.
And it was very fast. So in 90 days, we completely remade the movie. I have to credit Mark Gill at Warner Independent, who also saw the vision of changing what was there to what could be, while other distributors ran away in horror.
Right. And this is something, you know, that I always want to come back to in our discussion whenever I teach is it's storytelling. You, by changing the soundtrack, you changed the story that was told. So what did you really want to emphasize? Because I'm sure that everyone in this audience saw this when they were pretty young, and you know, I think it'd be great if you all went back to it because there's a really potent story that you ended up drawing out. So what did you want to really get across?
I just saw it as the perfect family film.
Uh-huh.
It's a story about family and devotion.
Right.
It's about dads who sit on an egg while the mom goes out and has dinner.
Yeah.
That's spectacular, right?
It really is.
And, you know, and even though there had been, you know, you could go back and you would find nature documentaries about penguins and migration before. So it's not as though it hadn't been covered. It had never been done in that way with the beauty.
Right.
And I do think that making the choice to have Morgan tell the story almost like a fable, makes a huge difference in how the film is received.
Right, and so it was received extremely well.
Yeah.
So the box office was tremendous, the critical reviews were tremendous, and for you at National Geographic, it probably gave you a lot of freedom at that point.
We did more movies after that.
Yeah.
It was like, it still stands as the highest grossing nature film ever made, second highest grossing documentary ever made, and we won the Academy Award.
Right.
So we had, it was crazy good fortune that early out of the gate in that company.
So what did, you're at your second year now at National Geographic, and you're saying, what do I do now? So what was your goal at that point?
Well, at that point we started to, we made more documentaries, more movies, and we started developing some films. Some of which came out even after my tenure. We made, as a narrative movie, Peter Weir's most recent film, which is called The Way Back, which is a really gorgeous, brilliant film.
Right.
And then at a certain point, National Geographic looked at it and they decided film was not really part of their core business.
Okay.
And they decided they didn't really want to keep doing it, so...
That was the beginning of your transition out then. Yeah. So you got to make a number of documentaries, all nature films at that point, right?
Actually, not all nature films.
Okay.
There's a film that I love deeply called God Grew Tired of Us, which is about Sudanese refugees coming to America and the experience that they had there. We did a film called America, which is a narrative film, the first film directed by Shireen Dabbas, and the first film directed by a Palestinian-American filmmaker that was ever given a nationwide release, which is also an immigrant story about a Palestinian mother and son who come to a suburb of Chicago. And their first year here in this country. And then we also made some nature films like Derek and Beverly Joubert's The Last Lions.
Right. So you really were able to incorporate a wider range of stories within that realm that, at least for a few years, National Geographic was fine with doing that. But then there was the transition out, and you started working as an independent producer at that point.
Yeah.
So what was the new goal, or the evolution of the goal at that point? Was it to continue working in documentary, just nature films, or, and I know the answer, which is just telling good stories. But you had a specific kind of focus.
Well,
at that point.
I actually had I changed my personal business model. One of the things that I've discovered is that we're all entrepreneurs for ourselves, and the only business any of us are ever in is our own business. Prior to National Geographic, I'd been an independent producer. It was a time when you could really be an independent producer. Studios cared about producers. You could get deals, you could get overhead deals. They might give you space on the lot. They might pay you something for an office or an assistant or give you some development money. 7 years after that, the landscape had changed. Studio production deals had almost fallen by the wayside. And I changed my business model because I realized that it was not really viable just to be an independent producer unless you're independently wealthy. You can't really do that.
Right.
And that's not me.
Right.
So I turned my business into an advisory business where I advise and consult with production companies, entities that wish to finance films, and producers to help them navigate through the entertainment landscape, deciding if they should invest, how they should invest, if the movie should be made, how it might be made, if it's made, how it could be distributed. Yeah. And that ended up leading me into producing some films, because sometimes when you're advising people and they realize the scale of what producing a film entails, they say, Adam, would you just do it for us? It's like, yeah, okay. Happy to do it.
So let's transition then to the film at hand, A Plastic Ocean. Extremely powerful, disturbing, but an important story, an important, hopefully part of an important movement. So let's talk about, at what point did you come into that process? Because I know it was somewhat not even much earlier than like with March of the Penguins, where you came into a film that had already been cut. Here, there wasn't even anything resembling a film, correct?
Not a film you'd want to see.
Okay.
Has anybody had a chance to see A Plastic Ocean? I can't. Okay, well, it's on Netflix, it's on iTunes. I commend it to you. I think it's really good. I got involved in this. The film was financed by several large nonprofits, principally an NGO called Plastic Oceans Foundation, who wanted to have a social impact with the film. They had been shooting for a period of time. Most of the film had actually been shot, and they had actually done a string out, which didn't have any narrative cohesion to it. They asked me to come on board to see if there was a way to manage and reshape that. So my job was to figure out what the narrative would be, and then find a way to tell the story. It took a year. The process started when we asked them to ship all the hard drives to us. The hard drives had been in storage at a facility in Bristol, England, because some of our team had worked with the BBC Natural History Unit, and they're located in Bristol, so we were at a storage facility in Bristol. They built a crate. The crate was about a quarter the size of the stage, about 4 feet high. You could put 5 bodies in it if you wanted to. I don't know how they got it through customs. The crate arrives at our post house. We pry it open with crowbars, and inside the crate are 100 hard drives packed in straw all in different formats with no cables. The first month was finding cables and seeing what was on the hard drives. So we hired an editor, and we looked at it, and then we figured out what else do we have to shoot to cause there to be a grand narrative in the story.
Right. This is a little tangent, it's a little tech talk, but for any of you who are now just starting to make films, drives are your film. I mean, that's your roll of film. Mm-hmm. And the value, hopefully your teachers are telling you, the value of preserving and backing up those drives and keeping your cables is, it cannot even begin to start to emphasize how critical it is.
Yeah, and may I add,
please,
naming conventions, with editorial naming conventions, so you can look on the list and know what is what, whether it's subject matter or date of shoot or something, consistently follow it all the way through, because you'll forget and you have to go back and find things. If you don't have naming conventions, it's a nightmare.
It was, yeah. I went to the Arctic on an icebreaker last summer.
Oh, fantastic.
With the Coast Guard in the shooting of Microcosm, this film that I'm now working on. And one of the hardest things I had to figure out was how many drives to take with us.
Right.
And how many for backup, because there's no replenishing your drives.
Right.
Amazon can't send a drone and drop it off.
Right.
And naming, how to name everything.
Right, exactly.
So it's one of those things that this is our era. Mm-hmm. So you had to take that, and how big of an editorial crew did you have working on this?
One editor, one assistant.
Oh my gosh. And so they're working full-time, 40, 60 hours?
Whatever it takes.
Yeah. And in a month, you had some sense of what was there?
In a month, they had pulled things off the drives and started to put them into bins.
Yes.
To start to figure out, so we could start to look at it and talk about what a narrative would be.
So you're, in a sense, you're the creative producer at this point. You are creating the story. And again, this is something, especially for people who do social issues, I think it's really important that to say, I want to do something about the plastic ocean. I want to do something about, the pet industry. But what's the story you're telling? Mm-hmm. So you saw it and you said, what is the story? How do we cobble this together?
Right.
So what was your instinct at that point?
This was not an instant instinct. It took a while to figure out the instinct that was right. And it's the way we started the trailer you just saw, which is, the film follows two people, Craig and Tanya. Craig, who is an ocean-loving journalist, and Tanya, who is a freediver. An incredible freediver. Tanya Streeter is the first woman to break a men's sports world record. She dives deeper than the crushing depth of World War II submarines. And freediving means you don't have an oxygen tank. She looks like a normal person, but she's really a superhero.
Yes.
She's amazing. But we decided that the through line of the story would be Craig, for whom the whale has always been his spirit animal, was off the coast of Sri Lanka trying to capture the first footage of a newly born pygmy blue whale, which had never been photographed before. They ended up getting the shot. But in the water, there's all this plastic muck, and it doesn't make any sense because the beaches had been closed for 30 years because of the Civil War. This is not in the shipping lanes. Where does all this plastic come from? And with that question, we now begin a quest that goes to 20 locations around the world, literally circumnavigating the globe to discover how plastic gets into the ocean, what happens when it does, and then what we can do about it. The last part's really important because I don't want to make a documentary which makes you feel really depressed.
Right.
I really care about showing solutions, of which there are many. And the last act of the documentary is all about solutions.
Yeah, which is, I think, utterly critical and why I would encourage people to watch it, besides the fact that it's just an amazing
I would also like
film.
to thank DePaul University, glass, not plastic.
Thank you.
Really good.
Yes,
Thank you,
no
DePaul.
plastic bottles. Yeah, no plastic bottles. Did you know from the beginning that you wanted to go beyond the doom and gloom? And I say that with much affection because there's so much wonderful doom and gloom movies out there, but we have to offer solutions.
Yeah, I didn't even want to make the movie unless there were solutions.
Yeah. So That said, how long did it take from that point then to edit together what became the final movie?
14 months.
Okay. Okay. What was the hardest part of that process?
It took us a good 6 or 7 months to really figure out what the story would be.
Mm-hmm.
And then, having figured out the story, it was just the laborious process of what goes in, what falls out.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of stuff is not in the movie. And just making those judicious choices, and then shooting new scenes, connecting material, interviews with people, so it really strung together.
Yeah, yeah. Anything amazing and fortuitous that just happened in that process as you were putting together the story and shooting new footage that just made you say, yes, we are moving in the right direction?
Well, one thing we got and one thing we didn't get. I was able to shoot a really good interview with Craig, where I just sort of had him talk through everything. Mm-hmm. And we established that interview very early on in the show. And then we just use his voiceover, so he's telling us the story. So it's not a narrated movie, but we have a character who's telling us what he's going through. And that was an idea that ended up being really narratively important. Mm-hmm. The thing we missed, that if we'd been like 3 days earlier we would have gotten, is that during this period, Tanya Streeter had her second child. We really wanted to be there to photograph the birth of that child because of the mother-child connection and the responsibility parents have for children, and the questions that parents have about, like, what world am I bringing my child into? What am I putting into my child's body as my child is fed? And that would have been very powerful, but the baby came early. We just didn't get there in time.
Baby was on its own schedule.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that takes us to this final thing before we go to the Q&A, which is social impact documentaries.
Yeah.
And what is their purpose? A lot of us say, I have to tell this story. That's great. That's why we're all doing what we do. I have to tell this story no matter what it takes. But that's not enough. We want to engage the audience. We want to bring the audience to us.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about how you see that now as a producer of this type of movie, and how do you address bringing the audience to you?
Right. Well, maybe it'll be illustrative to talk about how we actually got this movie out into the world.
Yeah.
I really believe in social impact documentaries. Also, because I don't believe that documentaries are a for-profit art form. I can't look an investor in the eye and say, you're going to make money, invest in this documentary, because really, you won't. But if you're a nonprofit organization, and all of my docs now are funded by NGOs of one kind or another, who want to have a social impact, if you're a nonprofit organization, I can say, for what you would spend on a half dozen opinion maker spots on CNN, that people will fast forward through or go to the bathroom while they're playing. They're just trying to get a senator to vote one way or the other on the Dakota Access Pipeline. For what you would spend on that, you can make a documentary that will be 80 or 90 minutes. It will let people see what the situation is, have a story to tell others, and have a deep narrative that people can get emotionally involved in. I think it's the best money that an NGO can spend if they want to have social engagement. But it has to be an issue where there can actually be an audience. So if you saw on this trailer, in addition to the logo for Plastic Oceans Foundation, at the end there's also the logo for Plastic Pollution Coalition, which is one of the leading organizations that deals with plastics in our environment. Very early on, as we were getting near the end of our process, probably about a year before we launched the film into the world, we made a relationship with Plastic Pollution Coalition. They're a coalition of a couple hundred other NGOs around the world. So they have a reach of tens of thousands of people. I believe in cutting together and putting together all the marketing materials first, before you try to get distribution. I've been a distributor. The first question a distributor asks is, how am I ever going to sell this thing?
Right. We
don't want distributors to ask that question. We want to say, not only here's how you sell it, but we can prove to you there is an audience for it.
Right.
So they don't ask the question, we just give it to them all in one beautiful package tied up with a ribbon on top. We put together a very good one sheet, a very good website with the logos of all the affiliated organizations, NGOs, and brands that were supporting us. On one day in the fall of about a year ago, we said to everybody, we're going to put the trailer on Facebook and YouTube. On this day, tell all of your followers to watch the trailer. 12 days later, we had 500,000 views on the trailer. The next day, we shared it to distributors.
Right.
And so we had not only had we reached the audience and seeded interest in the audience in the film, we'd shown distributors there is an audience, and we'd done the work for them.
Right. Right. You anticipated their questions.
Exactly.
Right. Which is, I think, the hardest thing for a lot of filmmakers in general, and specifically doc filmmakers, to say, I need to think about what the distributor is going to want to see, because that's how you engage your audience. That's how you tell the story to more than 40 people.
Exactly.
Right?
All distributors care about is butts in seats or downloads or rents.
Right.
That's all they care about are their numbers.
Which sounds horrible on some level. I recognize that,
Right.
especially if you're really passionate about telling your story, but that's a part of the business too.
Yeah, I think it's the most difficult moment in any creative pursuit, whether you're making a film or writing a novel or doing a play, is there's this moment where your passionate work shifts into a commodity. And all distribution channels, publishers, et cetera, they view it all as it's commodity.
Right.
They're in the commodity business. They're pushing commodities through their pipeline. And because they will never learn how to speak artist, artists need to learn how to speak distributor.
Let's just write that down,
what we have to
okay?
do.
Just everybody write that down right now, because it is the key.
Yeah.
It is totally key, transitioning that bridge. That if you don't think about it, they're going to think about it. So you should get ahead of their thinking about it, right?
Yeah, and it's and again, having been in the distribution universe and distributing. When I was at Nat Geo, we ultimately built a distribution company, so I was distributing movies, I was acquiring movies. It's a buyer's market.
Right.
There are thousands of finished movies made every year that don't get any form of distribution at all and are just sitting in a hard drive in somebody's attic somewhere.
Right.
You don't want that to be your movie.
Right. You want the movie out there, and you want it to have the impact that you're hoping it can have. And so the movie is just one part. I shouldn't say just, but it's the focus. It's the spear, the tip of the spear that's leading something that's much bigger, though.
Exactly.
So talk about that. It's not just a movie, is what I like to say to my students. It's a movement.
It's a movement. Well, again, Plastic Ocean. Don't mean to keep coming back to it, but it's my recent example.
It's what you're doing. Yeah.
We ended up launching it. It had its theatrical release inauguration weekend.
Stop and think about that,
Stop
guys.
and think about that for a minute. Christiana Monpour, who was a reporter on CNN, to whom we had given the film a couple of months before, saw the movie shortly before it opened, ended up doing a report on CNN Worldwide saying, look at all the climate change and science deniers that 45 is putting into the White House cabinet. But if you really want to see what's going on in our environment, see this movie. So we ended up opening as the #1 doc in the US, the UK, and Canada. That helped. Thank you, Christiane. You helped us a lot. You brought a lot of awareness to it. We then hit iTunes shortly thereafter, and then we hit Netflix in April. What's really amazing about this film is that even though anybody can watch it right now, iTunes or Netflix, it's still being booked for live performances. It's being booked at festivals all over the world because people like to see it in community. NGOs are booking theaters and seeing it in community. The U.S. State Department has put it into more than 40 embassies where they've not just shown it in the embassy screening rooms, they've, like in Rome, they rented a 600-seat house and showed the film. So it's screened now in 60 countries. It's in 22 languages. In May, we were invited to the United Nations, and we screened it and presented it at the UN, hosted a panel there. 4 weeks ago, it screened at Australian Parliament. The week later, they changed the law about plastic bags. Right. So it actually has a really significant impact, which is so much bigger than the movie. That's the movement part of it you're talking about.
Absolutely. And France is what I understand, is eliminating all plastic cutlery by 2024. Is
Yep.
that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So think about that, guys. What are you going to do when you go? Well, I don't know if that'll ever happen here, but it was hard enough just to do the plastic shopping bag law in Chicago, but we did get that passed.
Right.
So things are happening all over the country.
Exactly.
Excuse me. Well, we are now moving on to Q&A.
Fantastic.
So I am having a hard time here, so if you do have, why don't you just raise your hand or just speak up?
We can't see you because of the
yeah.
lights. So
Yeah. Oh, there's a mic. All right.
okay, find the mic, because you can see the mic, we can't.
So please start with somebody's coming over. I see them. Hi. Hi.
I am Jose Soto. I'm also a professor here. Hi. My question is, I love the metaphor of the spear and the movie being at the point of the spear. I'm just wondering, shouldn't the marketing be the point of the spear and then the movie comes after that? Isn't it the marketing that opens or paves the?
Yeah, I think sequentially you're absolutely right. Sequentially, the marketing builds the awareness. The movie is the thing that you're marketing, so you need something to market, because you can't just tell people do this or care about it. You need to ask them to take an action. In this case, the action is see the movie. But then, if you're dealing with a social impact movie, there is a long tail of social impact movement that follows the movie. But you're right. In marketing, and the thing, particularly in the independent film space, this is not just about documentaries. It's about all independent movies. We do not have a marketing budget. So what we need is time. We need to get out in front of it early. A year is not too long to begin seeding awareness in the marketplace for your film, because a studio can buy awareness. A typical independent film that's released by a small distributor has a marketing budget of $5 million, which might be the budget of all of your movies in this audience combined right now.
Times 20.
Right? So there's no way we can compete with that. We just don't ever have that marketing budget, but we do have time. Studios, even independent distributors, can do this thing that they call buying awareness. They can buy awareness. They can buy commercials. They can put up billboards. They can put things at the supermarket when you check out, so you get to sort of see the title and know something about it. We don't have that luxury. We have to use a lot of time to build affiliations and associations with interested groups, addressable audiences that will push out the information about our films.
Thank you. That is so revealing. My field is not documentary. I'm more on the scripted side of
Right.
television, and a lot of people have been trying to push web series as the next big thing, but they don't realize that they need to do this. Exactly what you're mentioning. They need to have an audience before they release the web series. The web series is not going to find an audience on its own.
Exactly. The web series that are successful, including those that have made the jump to cable or YouTube Red, all have professional marketing people behind them. Not only that, 98% of all YouTube videos that go viral are professionally produced and have a professional marketing thing behind the scenes pushing them to go viral.
Yes.
It doesn't just happen. It is a heavily constructed situation.
Right.
Excellent.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
More questions? I'm hoping. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you use, I have a feeling you should use the mic just because they're doing video recording, and otherwise we won't be able to hear you.
And we're streaming right now. We're
We are.
live.
Hi to everybody who's streaming.
Okay, hi. My name's Alexa Adler, and I'm actually a reporter from Medill at Northwestern.
Great.
So I have a two-part question for you. My first question is the goal of the movie or the documentary a plastic ocean for us to get rid of all plastic, or is it more to bring awareness, or sort of what's the end goal?
The goal is absolutely not to get rid of all plastic. Plastic is amazing. There are people who are walking because they have plastic hips. It is a spectacular, malleable product. The purpose of the film and of Plastic Oceans Foundation is to change the perception of plastic within a generation. My belief is that plastic is great, it just should not enter the environment. And it should be stopped from entering the environment, because plastic is not biodegradable. Every piece of plastic ever made is still somewhere on this planet. It just breaks down into microparticles, so you can't see it, and then there are certain toxicity things that occur when it enters the waterways. But it's absolutely not anti-plastic. It's pro-plastic, just anti-plastic in the environment.
Okay, great, thank you. And then you've also had a very long career in Hollywood. So my second question is, how do you think the Harvey Weinstein scandal will change Hollywood culture?
I was waiting for that question.
I had to ask, sorry.
No, you have to ask. It's a really important question. You know, less than a week before the Weinstein scandal broke, a gunman shot more than 500 people from his perch on the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Hotel. And gun laws haven't changed in this country. I make that analogy because I really want there to be change. There are many good-hearted people who want there to be change. I have not yet seen a movement for true systemic change. I think it's too early to tell. My hope is with change. Haven't seen it happen yet.
Thank you so much.
I think there's this level of human decency, which kind of, and ethics, which kind of underlie a lot of just our efforts as filmmakers, as storytellers, is when we want to engage an audience, it's for this kind of greater moral perspective. And I think everything from gun laws to sexual abuse fits into that. I think it's there's a continuity there, I think. Any more questions? Yes, we need you to, yes, please, thank you. And this will be our last question, by the way, so looking forward to it.
Hello.
Where'd he go?
Hi.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing in regards to social impact and transforming the world through films like this, docs like this. My question to you as a producer is, what do you look for in your team? Because isn't it one of the main tasks of a producer to gather the troops?
Great question.
Yeah, it's a perfect question. I look for people who are really good collaborators and who care passionately about what we're working on. People for whom this is not just a job, but something of a calling. I also look to their past history of what they have worked on and how their work is, and I try to match their sensibility to the sensibility that is needed for the specific project.
Yeah, it does.
Does that answer your question well enough?
And it tailors it to each specific project. So you see what you need, and then
it's a very custom thing. I've worked with the same people in many different contexts, but I do not always work with the same editor,
Right.
the same composer, the same director, because they're not always all right or even necessarily available for every project. It's really about putting together the right team and their personality issues as well, making sure that people can actually get along. I look for good communicators. I look for people who are profound artists and care as much about the poetry of cinema as great narrative storytelling. And people who care a lot about talking to the audience, who are making the film for something beyond themselves, for the wider world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great question, and a great way to wrap things up. So thanks very much for coming here, visiting us in the Windy City, and thank you all for coming. So thank you, Adam Leipzig.
Thank you.